Mr. President, can you help us understand your view of Putin's timeline with regard to an endgame in NATO? And to what degree do you think the Europeans understand what his objectives are with regard to NATO?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Well, I think it's hard to say what the timeline is, but the goal is clear that as long as the EU and equally and more importantly NATO is united and has maintained its current membership, then policies of an entity that is much larger, much richer, much more powerful than Russia leaves Russia in at a disadvantage. If you break up NATO, then every country except for the United States is going to be smaller than Russia. If you break up the EU, then the largest country in the EU at 80+ million people is Germany, and compared to Russia, again, it's small. And then when you think of NATO with countries like mine, then we're quite minuscule and would be at a distinct disadvantage. Now, that's the goal, I would argue, and has been the goal for a while, because if you read even Yeltsin-era op-ed pieces or opinion pieces, Russia does not wish to deal with a European Union, but bilaterally, and so too, of course, NATO has been a bête noire ever since 1949. So again, it's hard to say what the timeline is, but certainly with the amount of pressure we see today put to crucial elections this year in Europe, where support is going every time to anti-NATO, anti-EU, and anti-US fringe parties, basically, and with success, that this is part of the plan. And were you to, for example, get France to step out of NATO and the European Union, that would be a death blow or near death blow to both organizations.
Do you think there's been an acceleration in his ambitions from first trying to cause panic and understandable paranoia among smaller near neighbors to striking deeper into Europe, where it seems like public understanding of the historic significance of NATO is on the wane?
I think he was surprised by the success that they met with the Ukrainian crisis, in which they actually managed to penetrate serious so-called objective news sources, where you saw the BBC repeating propaganda lines on Ukraine to so-called balance the reporting from Ukraine. So repeating stories about that were purely fake as sort of as the kind of balancing side. And I think that encouraged them, saying it works. It really does work.
Thank you. Ms. Conley, I want to ask you some questions, but I'd just like to acknowledge the chairman reset my 5-minute clock, so I'd like to say thank you, and I'm going to use all of my extra time. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. Only for you.
Ms. Conley, can you tell us a little bit about Putin's internal political constraints with regard to the illicit economy? Are there shades of gray inside the illicit economy of some of his cronies who are worried about the adventurism and think that in industry X, Y, or Z, this is more dangerous than people who just like his distraction tactics to prop himself back up at home with the adventurism?
Thank you, Senator. Well, the Russian economy and President Putin's management of it has stabilized the economy for now. The long-term trajectory is quite dire. It appears that the Siloviki, this sort of the inner circle of their business interests, have remained fairly stable. There is certainly changes, cannibalization, if you will, of different companies nationalized to maintain benefits, but the economy is under great strain. What we found in our report, interestingly, in all of these Russian influence operations, there was a connection to President Putin's inner circle. So certainly enriching and continuing to enrich that small inner circle is very important. But I think there's a myth in some ways that the sanctions have had a devastating impact on the Russian economy. They have hurt them, but they have stabilized. He is working very hard. President Putin understands he's now having to harden. That's why he is created his own National Guard. He knows things are going to get very rough, but he is stabilizing the economic situation. He's ready for the long term and making sure that inner circle, which there have been changes, there's generational changes going on right now. He's passing leadership from his peers to another generation. He's sculpting them. So I think we have to understand their further enrichment is very important, but we're seeing impact of lack of payment to pensions and teachers. The social welfare system is crumbling, but the inner circle is being maintained.
How rich is Putin?
I have no idea, sir.
Any of you have any estimates, Mr. President? You're not usually bashful.
Well, the reports say 100 billion, but who knows? But certainly it's a lot.
And just to be clear, for the record, this is a guy who's a public sector bureaucrat for most of his life, and we think he might be worth on the order of $100 billion. There's no moment of significant private sector activity where he had a stake in a private equity company or something.
But this is a pattern repeated across the board among senior leaders in public service in Russia. I mean, we have press secretaries with $30,000 Swiss watches.
Mr. Weinstein, were you trying to jump in there? You know some of the history on the guy?
No, I'm a little perplexed how a public servant gets $100 billion in his bank. Wish I could do that.
I don't see that spreading through the Congress.
And I know I'm at time, so just one parting question. How likely do you think it is that congressional IT systems have been infiltrated by Russian security services?
Unless you use two-factor authentication, almost certain.
Dr. Buchanan?
I think that I'd be very concerned if you put me in charge of congressional IT tomorrow. I would not spend my first action looking outward. I would look inward, but that is true of any high-priority network at this point. Find the intruders who are already inside.
Thank you all for your work.
Senator Durbin.